Hey guys, today I'm going to be showing you the 5 programming concepts I think you need to know in programming. So if you're a beginner trying to get into programming, I think this will be really helpful for you because you can kind of narrow down what you need to know uh, to be a programmer. You don't need to do too much extra stuff. If you understand these 5 concepts, I think you can already work your way into being a programmer. So let's get started. I'm going to be using this environment to show some examples. I'm going to be using Python as my programming language, just pretty much because it's easier to understand and there is not a lot of overhead to get started with it. So to get started, let's talk about what a comment is. This is not one of the concepts, but I think to understand what's happening here, you need to know what that means. So in Python, if you have these pound signs before some text, it's not gonna be treated as part of the program. So if I run this entire thing, nothing's gonna be outputted because because it's all commented out. So let's go through the first concept, which is gonna be concept of input output. I don't have an example for an input for input to programs right now because of the environment we're using. But usually, a program would take an input in the terminal or from some UI. But for now, I'm just going to show you what an output is. And if I comment that out and run this code, we're going to see here, we see hello world. So I'm just telling the program to output this text to usually a terminal, but in this case, it's to this output tab here. So let me comment that out. And if I ran this again, nothing's going to happen because I commented that out. So that's the first concept of input output. Every program needs an input and generally gives an output. So next concept I'm going to talk about is going to be variables and data types, but I'm not going to dive too deep into data types. But in upcoming videos, I'm going to break down each of these concepts into separate videos. So let's comment this snippet out right here. So what I'm doing here, this is called a variable. In Python, there is in every language, there is some syntax on how you name variables. Generally, you can just use like alphanumeric characters, but generally speaking, you start with the alphabet. So this is fine. So the variable is called name, and the value of the variable is a string, which is a text. And I'm gonna output this this text here afterwards. So what I expect this program to do is to say my name is John. So let's run this and we see my name is John. I should have capitalized that, but yeah, who cares? So that's an example of a variable. So I store some data, which is in this case the string John. I store it in this variable, and then I can utilize that variable and get that value in that variable somewhere else in my program. So I'm going to comment this back out. And let's move on to the next concept. The next concept is going to be conditionals. And this is in programming pretty much how you decide what path to go in your program, what your logic should do. So here I create a variable called age. I assign it the value of 18. Here I'm gonna check if that age is over 17. Yeah, so this means greater than sign. So in this case, we're comparing numbers. So what the if syntax does is it's going to take the value of age, compare it to, in this case, 17. And if it's greater than, it's going to print adult to the output. And if it's anything else, which means in this case, it means it's less than 17, it's going to print child. So let's run this. So currently I have the age at 18. So let's see what it outputs. So the output is adult. So if you're great, if your age is greater than 17, according to this program, you're an adult. We all know that doesn't generally mean that based on how people think, but yeah, it is what it is. And if I would put this to, I don't know, let's say 10, for example, and I run this program again, it's going to output child. So that's the idea of a conditional. So it's pretty much implementing your logic to the logic to your program, how you take decisions. So the next concept is going to be for like loops in general. So they're in Python, there's two basic types of loops. There's the while loop and the for loop. And loops are pretty much iterating through a list of things, for example, or over a range of values. So let's see this first example here. This is going to be an example of a while loop. And the syntax is you have a variable. In this example, it's count. And I set the value to 0. And what I'm going to say is interpreting this is going to be while the count is less than or equal to 9, I want it to print that value. I want it to output that value to the terminal here, to the console. And I want to increase that count by 1. And it's going to run that once, and then it's going to come back here every time and check if this conditional holds true. So if I ran this, we're going to see 0, 1 to 9. So it's going to, the first time it's going to be a value of 0 as count. It's going to say, okay, are you less than or equal to 9? Okay, yes. It's going to print it out. Then it's going to increase that value. So what's happening here, we're getting the initial value and we're storing it back in that same variable. So here it's going to be 0, and you're going to add 1 to it and then write it back to that variable. So that's the concept of a while loop. So there's the other concept, the other example of a loop is going to be a for loop. And in the difference is, for loop, there is a determined range or number of values you're going to iterate through. In Python, the syntax to do this would be for some variable in a range of 9. So what a range does is it's a function that outputs pretty much just say like a list, and it's going to say for every value in that range, in this case the range is going to output 0 to 9, just print it out. And interesting here is it's going to print to 1 less than what you actually put here. So if I put 10, the output is going to be 0 to 9. But if I put 9, the output is going to be 0 to 8. So that's just that's a for loop using a range. But you can also for loop, you can also loop through a list of items. And in Python, this is how you indicate it's a list. You have these square brackets, and you have a list of values. In this case, I just use some fruits, and I'm going to say for each item, in the list, so it's going to go for each one, it's going to do something. In this case, it's going to print out every single one of them to the output. So that's an example of a for loop iterating through a list. And to iterate means to go through. I didn't explain that, but yeah. And the last concept we're going to talk about, the fifth and final one, is going to be functions. If you understand functions, you would go a long way. If you can get this idea of what a function does and how to use it, you would be able to pick up programming. You also need to understand the other concepts too, but this one's quite critical. Because when you work in industry on a high level, you're going to be working with functions. You're going to work with everything else, but bulk of your work is going to be done understanding what other people did with functions. So here, what I'm saying is I'm going to define a function. The function is going to be called add two numbers. It's going to take parameters as num1. That's going to be the first number and the second number. So in the definition of the function, that's where you explain what your function does with those parameters. In this case, is going to take a sum. It's going to sum up the two numbers and store it in a variable called sum. Then it's going to print out some text. So let's just, and then when you define your function, you have to call the function later. In this case, I call the function, I give it the argument of 2 and 4. So when you define a function, it's called a parameter. These values are like these text, it's called a parameter. But when you call the function, you give it some arguments. Yeah, so that's, but usually they're used interchangeably in industry, but in technically it's quite different concepts. So let's see what this outputs. So we see it tells us num1 is 2, num2 is 4, and 2 plus 4 is 6. Let's try it with, I don't know, let's say 4 and 12. And we see the same idea. Now, important here is I'm using the there is a string function being called here, and this comes with Python, and this pretty much converts an integer to a string, because using this plus sign here is how you join strings together, but it's also how you add numbers. So that's where the idea of data type comes in. So when you have a variable or you have a value in that variable, that value could be like an integer, which is number, or it could be a string, which is a string like a group of text of alphabets or characters rather. And yeah, and based on what the data type is, this is gonna act differently. So that's part of the definition of a data type. But I would explain these concepts in more details in the upcoming video. So stay tuned, and yeah, catch the next videos and learn more about this concept so you can start your programming journey.